Hi, I'm Alister, Benn, and welcome to Expressive Photography. Welcome back. Today we're going to focus on one composition, one photograph. So I'm going to call this episode The Making of a Photograph. And what we're going to do is I'm going to kind of recreate a composition that I found a few years ago when I was running a workshop here on the Outer Hebrides, and I found this foreground and fell in love with it. It was just one of those serendipitous moments, and pretty much every time I come back I try and make it again just because I really love it so much. The foreground itself is really incongruous. It always kind of somehow reminds me of a Scottish flag. There's some beautiful warmth in the pool in front of me with these cooler parts of the rock as well. It's taken with a 12mm prime, or I take it with my 12mm prime. It's the widest lens I have, and it's a shot that requires a certain amount of technique, purely because you got to get the camera right on top of the foreground to fill the bottom of the frame with this lusciousness, and then the rest of the frame just kind of pulls away into the distance and the rolling mountains. Because we're filling the foreground with something of great interest, the sky conditions aren't that impressive. I've never actually photographed it with a blazing sunset or anything like that. It's always been kind of moody and overcast. And I think somehow that's very evocative of the Scottish Highlands and the type of weather we get out here on a regular basis. So we're going to be focusing on this single photograph today. We're going to look at the in the field stuff, some of the considerations that we need to talk about in terms of, depth of field, sharpness, shutter speed, the composition itself, the vagaries of trying to get the camera in the right position using a tripod. All of these things require a little bit of fiddling about sometimes, but then I'm also going to record some very simple processing back on the computer in the hotel. I'm just going to process it on my laptop and process this photograph in a way that's considerate to the content without over glorifying the scene. We're not going to add anything, we're not going to add light or fancy glows or anything like that. We're going to keep it nice and simple to be representative of this beautiful island that we happen to be on right now. So I hope you enjoy this making of a photograph. It's one of my favourite compositions that I've found probably to date, certainly well up there as a favourite, and it's almost like an old friend now. So let's crack on. Let's have a look at me trying to get the tripod in the right position. This is a scene I know. I first photographed this quite a few years ago now, when I just stumbled upon it, and when I did, I was super excited because I'd never seen anything like it from this location before. So let's try and recreate it. Now, the first thing about this scene that we have to appreciate is just how close we have to get the tripod to the ground, because the foreground has to be just so incredibly dominant, and this is going to require a little bit of tripod skullduggery. to get the tripod in exactly the right place. And the big difficulty here is to make sure that we don't get the tripod legs in the frame, or indeed me in the frame. And this is the hardest part of this photograph. This ain't working. This is not very dignified. There we go. So, one of the great things about the Arca Swiss is that ability to just make these little subtle adjustments. And now we do have a difference between the sky and the foreground. So I'm just going to drop quite a heavy graduated filter just to bring down that sky somewhat. And there's very little to worry about with this photograph other than its level. The exposure's right and it's sharp. With this 12mm prime, the depth of field is incredible. With a 6-second exposure, I've been able to smooth out the surf coming over the back there. I just love this scene. It's just in the back of the camera, there's a tiny little bit of warm light on the sky there. Just this tiniest little pinky rose glow that's just bringing a little bit of warmth to the sky, but it's still quite cold. It's still quite a cool scene, and the beautiful warm rocks in the foreground there. Yeah, it's this is a scene that really speaks to me for some reason. So I'm just gonna make a few more adjustments. I can take it down to 1/8 of a second, just using the polarizer to take the shine off that foreground. Takes the shine off the water, and that just makes the colours very flat almost, and just very pastel. So here we are back in my studio. I never did get round to processing the photograph in the hotel after a day of getting blown around in gales and pouring rain. Dinner and an early night with a book was pretty much all we got round to. So here we are, we're back at home, and it's a few weeks now actually since I was in the field making that shot, and what I want to do now is revisit it and do the second half of this video, which is to look at the raw file, look at the composition, and then process it quite simply and probably reasonably quickly, but enough to deliver the feel that I want to do, the expressive quality that I want to feel, and the accuracy of the articulation of what I want to feel and express as well. And so if we jump into Lightroom here, this is actually the raw file. Now I'm actually using my new tablet that the wonderful people at Sensei Labs sent me a few months ago now, and I've been exploring it really amazingly. I mean, I've been doing a real deep dive with it, and I'm using it all the time. I'm not going to talk about it too much now, but certainly in a future video I'm going to be highlighting the benefits of this tablet. It's replaced my old Wacom Intuos Pro, which I was never 100% happy with, and this thing is unbelievable. So we'll be talking about that at some point. Anyway, right, here's the raw file, and as we can see with the J key selected, if I turn off the J key, you can see I've got a tiny bit of clipping in that area there. And the reason for that is because I was using the graduated filter and it's just darkened those rocks. We know that the blackest blacks should be in the front of the frame, and what that's doing is it's artificially bringing those areas of the frame forward. So we need to address that at some point. The second thing to consider is this is in the Adobe color space. So this is basically what Lightroom is going to import at unless you specify otherwise. And if we click on the 4 little dots there, you can see we've got a number of different presets from Adobe Landscape, Portrait, Vivid, of course, Standard, and then these new Adobe Neutral, which is a linear profile. The neutral color profile is going to make it look flatter and less dynamic, and I think maybe in a future video I will explore using the neutral linear profiles, but for now I'm just going to stick it in landscape because I want a rich and vibrant landscape shot anyway, and all I'm going to have to do is recreate some of that contrast. I mean, by going into the neutral and making it contrasty. I don't believe the difference is that significant. So for now, I'm just going to use that. I'm going to re-engage the J key. And so the first thing I want to do is to determine accuracy. Now, I only actually made 2 frames here. I did a 6-second exposure, which is this one, and then the next frame is an 8-second exposure. For some reason, I decided that those 2 frames were enough, and I was quite happy with what I'd achieved. The composition was king here, and I wanted to make sure it was right. In terms of the shutter speed, I was happy with the way the water has drifted over that area in the middle there. So what we'll do first is talk about the composition. This shot is about the foreground. As I mentioned in the video at the beginning there, the foreground, I just fell in love with it. All of those triangles and crisscrossy type lines. And there is something like a Scottish flag in there to my twisted patriotic brain. But again, much like last week's video when we were finding warmth and riches in the foreground, to compensate perhaps, or to juxtapose against a fairly flat and featureless sky, this is a similar thing, although we do have a fraction more warmth in the sky this time than we had last week. The foreground here is so rich, so full of interest and engagement. And if we look at the 5 triggers of luminosity, contrast, color, atmosphere, and geometry, geometry and color are currently the 2 most dominant foreground qualities. The luminosity in the water is further through the frame, and the white of the surf is actually brighter than anything in the foreground. The consequence of that is that it draws us through the frame. Our brain will always get drawn into the light. And we're using other geometric, so we have a crisscross here, so we've got these very strong diagonals which kind of take us into this point, and then the luminosity takes us back into this point, and then we have some more pointy triangles in the background and also somewhat of a triangle there at the back. It's all about triangles and diagonals, but there's also this beautiful sensual sort of curved line which adds a gentleness. There's this curve here which again adds gentleness, and there's big triangles in here as well. Triangles and sensual curved lines, there's a consequence to that, and it's going to make you feel that beautiful harmony between dynamics and sensuality or flow or peacefulness. The 6-second exposure was just a choice to get rid of some of the chaos. If I'd gone for a very short exposure, I misspoke in the video back there. I said 1/8 of a second. This exposure was 6 seconds, and then the second exposure was 8 seconds. It was quite a dull day, so just with a circular polarizer, I was getting that sort of longish shutter speed. I've talked before that with the manual 12mm Laowa lens, it doesn't record aperture in Lightroom, so I don't know what the aperture was, but I guess it was around about f16, something like that. As you can see from this file, the image is tack sharp front all the way through to the back. It's an incredible piece of glass, and that's one of the advantages of using super wide angled lenses. Is in landscape photography we have this huge depth of field. At 24 millimeters that is reduced, 50 millimeters massively reduced. Depth of field is just one of those things that you just have to learn to understand the implications of the aperture and the focal length. So let's start making this look like a photograph. The colors are somewhat natural. That seems to me quite accurate from memory. But what I do want to do is to start off with a short gradient in here. And I'm just going to lift the blacks ever so slightly. And what that does, gets rid of that clipping that existed in those darker rocks on the horizon line there. And while I'm at it, I'll just lift the whites a fraction. And I think I just want to have a look at the color in the sky. I don't want it too blue, but equally I don't want it horribly unnaturally warm. I might correct that globally later, but at the moment that's all I really wanted to achieve with that first gradient there. And you'll see if I turn it on and off, we've just lifted the back, and the consequence of that is it recedes. The background recedes into the frame, and even without doing any adjustments to the foreground, the background feels further away. If I turn it off again, we can see it feels just a bit gloomier and moodier, and everything feels closer. We turn on that very slight gradient, and all I've really done is lifted the blacks and opened the whites. I will mirror that with a foreground adjustment, and again I'm just using big broad brush strokes here, and what I want to do is add some luminosity to that foreground. I'm actually going to see how much I can darken the blacks until they start to clip. So I've got a tiny bit of, I clipped them and then I pulled it back a fraction, so I've only dropped the blacks by 2, so -2. And then I'm also going to just add a little bit of clarity and a little bit of detail. All of these adjustments are adding presence to the foreground. Texture, clarity, luminosity, darkening the blacks, all of those things are going to make the foreground feel as if you are standing on it. And that is a powerful landscape photography trick, is to make the foreground feel as if you're stomping on it, if you're right on top of it. I might actually take a second linear gradient just for that bottom section and add just a tiny little bit more crunch to the bottom of the frame, a fraction more detail, just so that we've got that definite tactility and sort of closeness in the foreground. Now, the way it's been composed, I've actually created the boundaries quite nicely in the field. All of that mucking around trying to get the camera in the right place was so that it was right. I'm pretty sure the horizon will be level because I'm pretty... Okay, this is an odd one. The horizon here, because it's an island, there's a slight distortion with what's going on in the actual foreground, in the background there. And it's one of those ones where if you straighten it, I'm not entirely sure it feels any better. I will straighten it though, because I think it probably does feel just a little bit more normal, less challenging. That background isn't actually level, it's an island, so there's a slight recession, whereas the bit at the left hand side is nearer than the bit further away, so it actually creates an angle in its own right. But this is a situation where flattening the horizon is going to make it feel right, ironically, even though it's not. I am going to look at the colour here to see, I'm going to boost those warmer tones, and then I'm going to have a little fiddle with the temperature and tint. It's to avoid, what we definitely want to do is avoid any greenness. And I'll probably take the blues down a fraction. Blues in a frame have a tendency to get out of control very, very quickly. They can get oversaturated, especially on cloudy days. It's very easy for that coolness to become a really saturated blueness. And if I just show you that, how quickly introducing too much blue makes it feel it doesn't feel right to me. I think what I may do here is stick on a radial gradient and invert that and just fractionally warm. I mean fractionally warm. It's very easy to do repetitive processing in shots like this, to make it so that you just do the same things, add a vignette, make it feel darker around the edges, all of those types of things. And I would strongly urge you to not do repetitive processing, because otherwise you just end up with all your shots looking the same. I could quite easily look at that vignette that I've just put on there and put in, a sort of typical darkening vignette. And okay, the idea that that's going to contain the shot and all of that type of stuff is fine, and it can work, but it's important to allow the shot to evolve on its own. So what I'm going to do is, instead, I'm going to come in and I'm just going to use a brush to paint in a little bit of cooler tones in here. I just like this stuff to stand out a little bit more, as to contrast with those to contrast more with those warm crosses, and again, that is just going to be a way. It doesn't need to be too warm, but certainly I want it warm enough so that there's a sense that there is tonal differences. So I've introduced a bit of that coolness into those foreground rocks, which helps the warmer rocks stand out. And I think what I'll do is I'll add a second brush with the opposite effect, where I'll warm and brighten a few of these. So this is kind of straightforward dodging and burning. There's nothing too unusual with this. It's just a way to introduce a little bit of tonal contrast and color contrast. It's nothing too dramatic. It's just enhancing what was there without overdoing it. And I think that's the key with shots like this, is to not overdo them. I'm going to go back to that sky here and just lift the whites a little bit more, introduce a little bit of highlight. I want this version of the photograph. I'm feeling very light-hearted today. I'm feeling very happy. I finished my book yesterday. It's going off to the designers. So Out of Darkness is finally going off to the design stage after 5 years in the making. And I'm feeling very light-hearted because I'm feeling good about finishing the book. And I want this photograph to feel, I want to allow the natural geology and the colours to speak. I'm going to add one more brush because I really just want to focus in on that teal green water at the back. And this is a function of the Harris landscape, is that beautiful water. It's a very deep sandy, or a shallow sandy bay, and there's a beautiful greenness to that water in there, and it just adds so much to this photograph. So again, this version I want to be bright and airy. What I'm going to do at the end of this video is I'll probably post at least one more version of this photograph that I've taken previously, just to see how the day changes the feel. There's a little bit of warmth in the sky. It is very, very subtle, and I don't want to overemphasize it, but I could give it a tiny bit of extra, you know, just to sort of allow it to speak a little bit. But that more or less is where I want to go with this shot. And yeah, I think to me it is a beautiful scene. It's a beautiful composition. It just struck me so strongly the first time I saw it. I need to reduce the blacks, or clipping a fraction in the foreground there again. The shot, when I first noticed it, it just leapt out of the landscape. It was just such an obvious foreground, even though we saw in the video how small it is. It's maybe only that type of size. Sometimes it's covered in boulders that get washed up over by the storms, so it's not always there. So yeah, hopefully this making of a shot has taught you something about the consequences of the 5 triggers: luminosity, contrast, color, atmosphere, and geometry, of course. That we don't need to do ridiculous processing to make an image effective. I like this. I mean, sure, I could muck around with it some more and maybe make it a bit more dramatic or whatever, but I'm happy to represent the landscape as I experienced it and as I want to express it. So hopefully you've got some value out of today's video. Next week we'll be back in the field, probably on another gloomy, overcast day on the Outer Hebrides, trying to make more photographs in between the rain. But for now, of the making of a photo or the making of a shot, we're done for today. Let me know what you think. If you like this stuff, hit the subscribe button, give us an old thumbs up. It's going to be 25,000 subscribers very, very soon, which I'm eternally grateful for, and I really appreciate all your support. Check out our learning material in the link below, which teaches the theory of all of these types of things in much, much greater detail. And of course, the Expressive Photography Members Forum, where you can post your own photographs and get involved in some deep dive discussions about the meaning of your photographs and other people's photographs, and how to be more expressive and creative. Thank you. That's it. We're done. Cut.